When I was a kid, there was this book I really liked called Frindle by Andrew Clements. The whole premise of this book is that the main character, Nick, learns that words get their meanings from how individuals use them, and so begins a campaign to create and popularize his new word for pen, Frindle. Initially, it starts out as a way to annoy his teacher, who is a hardliner against Frindle, but it quickly spirals out of anyone's control and becomes a nationally recognized synonym for pen. In the book's epilogue, the teacher informs Nick, now an adult, that she had been deliberately trying to Streisand affect Frindle into success by standing so strongly against it just to see if he could make it happen. And she sends him a copy of a dictionary that now includes a definition of Frindle as a gift. He sends her back the original Frindle, saying that it belongs to her and should be called whatever she thinks it should be called. And this book really stuck with me over the years because it was really compelling to think about where words come from. Who constructs language? Why? How? Why is a pen and not a Frindle? Why do the English say potato when the French say earth apple? Why do the French say just ananas when the English say pineapple? And for our purposes today, why is it called a C9 when a team accidentally loses a point in Overwatch after winning the fight because they stepped off the point? Also, I promise the defensive V3 video is still coming. It's just taking a lot of time and effort to both write and wrangle into something coherent, but it should be out in the next couple of weeks. There's also currently another members' choice poll going on between these 4 topics, and we're swapping things up to start doing ranked choice voting to try and make it a bit more fair and democratic, but there'll be more info on that at the end. Anyways, if we're going to explore this, it's probably best to start with where the term originated from in the first place. Part 1. The origins of C9. So, basic background information, C9 refers to an esports org, Cloud9. They were the org behind the London Spitfire in the Overwatch League, but prior to that, they had an Overwatch team under the Cloud9 banner as well. In 2017, Cloud9 was facing off against Africa Freaks Blue in Apex Season 2's group stage, which was a best of 5 round robin tournament. This was back when you could do non-Blizzard Overwatch esports. The term came into existence as a result of their face-off on Lijiang Tower, where after a solid Cloud9 win on the first point on Night Market, they pulled their now infamous move twice in a row.
Nanoboost Hughes are going to put that onto Gods, it looks like. He's got the whole hog. There's the pulse bomb going in and a couple kills. Mendo does get the one onto Dongyun. Going on to that, and it looks like Afrika Blue. Did they just not touch the point? I guess not. Well, that was a bit odd. Yet Mendo coming from behind with the tag visor. They're going to use the sound barrier as well. Arhan's going to get taken out. Can't really do much about that. Adam in trouble. Mendo trying to run away.
Nobody's on the point!
Are you kidding me? Again? What?
Oh,
that
man.
is 2 rounds in a row that Cloud9 could have easily contested that and no one was on the point. What a
Mendo
colossal mistake.
Now, if they'd only done this once, it might not have become such a big deal. People fuck up, it happens. If they'd done it twice, but had still gone on to win the series, same deal. An embarrassing drop map, but not the end of the world. The problem for Cloud9 was that they did it twice in a row on the very first map, then proceeded to lose the match to AF Blue, and then AF Blue and Cloud9 were tied for points at the end of the group stage, and AF Blue's win over Cloud9 was what allowed them to advance. This would obviously be enough for it to become notorious in esports, but it doesn't really explain why it became a commonplace term for casual, everyday Overwatch players. After all, there are tons of infamous fuck-ups in both esports and sports history, often ones that were way more consequential than this one too. Classic example is from the 1986 Stanley Cup playoffs, where the Edmonton Oilers and Calgary Flames were playing in the conference finals, which are basically just the quarterfinals. The Oilers had won the 2 previous Stanley Cups, beating the Flames both times in the process, and were looking for their 3rd in a row. It was game 7 of 7, hosted in Edmonton, and it was tied 2-2 heading into the 3rd period. And then, 5 minutes into that period, this happens. Straight up, this is one of the most unambiguous fuck-ups in sports history. Steve Smith tries to go for a pass, accidentally hits his goalie in the back of the leg, and scores a goal for the Flames. The game ends without another goal being scored, and the Flames make it all the way to the finals before finally being beaten by the Montreal Canadiens. It is, to date, the only time the Flames have ever beaten the Oilers in the playoffs. And, for some extra salt in the wound, the game took place on April 30th, which just so happens to be Steve Smith's birthday. That's an insane amount of fuck up, and what's more, all the conditions are there for it to be an iconic, memorable moment. And yet, this never turned into any sort of commonplace terminology. An own goal isn't known as pulling an Edmonton or a Steve Smith. It didn't become its own C9, and that is kind of notable. It tells us that C9 is something unique, not just in terms of being a fuck up or in terms of being a particularly notable failure, or even in terms of being an upset victory by an underdog. All of those things were true of Smith's 1986 own goal to a much greater extent than the original C9. And what's more, the worlds of casual and professional hockey are a lot more linked than casual and professional Overwatch. So then, why did C9 become a term? Part 2. How words get their meanings. Part of the reason why I started this video with the Frindle story is because it's a story all about how words become words, which is obviously relevant for us. But it's worth asking why the word was invented in the first place. In the story, it was to prove a point. Nick wanted to prove that words only have meaning because we create the words and give them meaning. And if enough people start calling pens Frindles, then they're Frindles as much as pens. However, most language isn't spawned out of spite. It typically evolves out of some combination of necessity, function, and cultural shifts. For example, and we're oversimplifying here for brevity, please don't bite my head off, pen as a word comes from Middle English, where it was a word for a feather with a sharpened quill that you'd use for writing, which in turn came from pen in Old French, which in turn originated in Latin as penna, which just meant feather. This makes sense given that modern pens evolved out of the use of feathers as writing utensils. At one point in time, quill and pen would have been functionally synonymous, but over time it's become more necessary to distinguish the two. You can still call a quill a pen if you want, I guess, but nobody's going to assume that you're talking about a quill because a modern pen isn't a quill. This is also important because culturally, a quill means something different to us than just a regular old pen. It's no longer seen as just a functional tool, but a symbol of a particular era of literature and culture. The quill was the dominant writing utensil in a lot of the world for over 1,000 years because it was cheap, convenient, and easy. All you needed was for a bird to drop a feather, some heat to treat it, and a knife to give it a proper tip. Nowadays, though, someone writing with a quill is clearly trying to invoke a certain image for both themselves and the people who see them. If someone told you that they take their university notes with a quill, you'd rightfully think that they're a massive douche, even though a couple hundred years ago that would be entirely normal behavior. And if they said they use a pen, there are a dozen different types of pen that might come to mind, and none of them would be a quill. With that in mind, it starts to become clear exactly why C9 became a commonplace term. Cloud9 weren't the first to make this exact mistake, either in Overwatch or in general, but it was a mistake that didn't really have a simple single word for it. You know how sometimes you'll see a translation of a word from another language that requires a whole lot of words to translate it into your language? That's often a sign that the concept in question that the word describes is one that was commonplace enough that it was necessary to have a shorthand for it for the people who spoke that language. It's not a perfect example, but consider poutine, a Quebecois French word to refer to a specific meal of fries, gravy, and cheese curds. Most languages didn't need a specific word for this, either because it wasn't a meal that they made there, or they didn't really find it notable enough to give it a name. However, in Quebec, it became a specific thing because of the combination of industries in the province, as well as the desire to develop and preserve their national identity. And it wouldn't do to just call it by some generic name or by some English name. It needed to be specifically Quebecois before all else. So, poutine it is. C9 became a term because, frankly, the gaming space really did need some sort of shorthand for this specific phenomenon. It happens often enough that it will come up in conversation in the context of gaming, but it's also a very specific set of conditions that all have to be met. A C9 doesn't just refer to losing a point or something. It has to be an unforced error by the offending team right at the end of the round after decisively winning the final fight and making it possible to capture the point and possibly win the game, only to forget to actually capture the point, walking away and accidentally handing the round to the enemy team. This is a really specific situation, but it's also not an uncommon one. Everyone's experienced a C9 either in terms of committing it or benefiting from your opponents committing it, provided you've played enough objective-based games. We can see it in both of the original C9s. In the first one, Cloud9 unambiguously had pushed Africa off the point, but then they got greedy and chased them off without capturing it, giving the point to Africa. In the second one, Cloud9 was fighting on the bridge while Mendo was on the point and had gotten halfway to capturing it before he decided to get greedy and peek the far to try and kill her with Visor, only to then get caught by the tail end of the Graviton Surge that stopped him from getting back to the point in time to contest. Then again, those situations aren't exactly meeting the definition I just gave. In the first one, Cloud9 had definitely pushed Africa back and could have captured the point, but it wasn't like they'd wiped the enemy team. In fact, there were 3 Cloud9 members who were dead when the match ended compared to only 2 from Africa, despite all 12 players being present for the beginning of the final fight. It was just that Cloud9 had pushed them all back and had control of the point even if they didn't capture it. The second one's a little more ambiguous though. Both teams were engaged in a team fight on the bridge, and both teams were down 3 people. It's not like one team or another was definitively winning the fight, but it's a C9 because Mendo was on the point and could have contested it and just didn't. Nobody pushed him off, he didn't have to leave, he just walked off. That's really the big thing with a C9. The other conditions can be fudged a bit, but it has to have been a voluntary, unforced error. If you walk off the point because of a Diva Bomb, that's not a C9. If the people contesting the point get wiped and another team member can't get there in time, that's not a C9. If it's a neck and neck fight where both teams are fighting it out and one eventually triumphs because the overtime is on such a short fuse that stepping off for half a second to stay alive gives them the point, it's not a C9. If the defending team doesn't notice that a Sombra snuck behind them to backcap because they're overextended, it's not a C9. It has to be a situation where the team committing the C9 were entirely capable of contesting or even capturing the point and just straight up walked away. But if you've ever seen the term C9 used, you've almost certainly seen it used wrong. And that's the next topic. Part 3. How language gets warped. Whenever you create a new term to describe a complex concept with a single word, you aren't just creating shorthand for that old concept. You are, in effect, creating a new concept. Once you start calling poutine poutine instead of just gravy, fries, and cheese curds, you're creating the concept of poutine and a dispute about what is or is not real poutine. What kinds of cheese can be used? What kinds of gravy? What kinds of potatoes? What's the ratio? What utensils do you eat it with, if any at all? What's the best kind of poutine? Who invented poutine? Not who invented the idea of gravy, cheese curds, and fries, but specifically who invented poutine. Also, I know the pronunciation sounds a bit pretentious, but again, just like with many things on this channel, I'd rather say it a little bit pretentiously and not get jumped by the people who speak the language than say it too Anglo. When I lived in Montreal, there were a million places where you could get delicious poutine, but plenty of purists would argue that most of it wasn't real poutine. You could get protein poutine with sausage and bacon and stuff, or you get poutine with cheese sauce, or you get poutine with various vegetables or other mix-ins, or whatever else. None of which would be described specifically as fries with gravy and cheese curds, but all of which are described, at least by some people, as poutine. This is part of the challenge with C9. It's really easy to watch those two examples and identify some of the fundamental common characteristics between them. And the reason why C9 became such a common term was because it was easy to recognize those characteristics in our own personal experiences of the game. Everyone has been spectating a teammate when it's 99-99 and watched them walk off the point, handing it to the other team. If you want to vent about it to your friends, you don't want to have to pull a Ross Matthews like, you know that thing where your team is winning the fight, but then everyone else just walks off the point, leading to the other team winning the point in spite of losing the fight because we just straight up forgot about the point? That's what this is giving me. Because frankly, it's just less punchy, right? You want to be able to say, this fucking moron C9'd. If you want to trash talk, you don't want to have to say, now your team walked off the point even though they decisively won the fight, giving us a point even though we should have lost. You want to say, now you dipshit C9'd. And that's not just for convenience either. Words don't just have definitions, but also connotations. C9ing carries a specific type of shame with it. It's uniquely embarrassing because it describes a uniquely embarrassing type of fuck up. A C9 isn't getting beaten by the better team. You'd say skill gap if that was the case. It's getting beaten by your own lack of object permanence. It's saying you are a goo goo gaga baby who straight up did not remember the point just existed at all and chased the jangling keys right into a loss even though you objectively played better. You managed to pull off a sick kickflip only to trip walking down the stairs and give yourself a concussion. It's a way of telling someone, you're pretty good at this game. Which makes it even funnier that you're somehow dumb enough to cancel out that skill. In contrast, part of the reason why the Steve Smith thing never turned into a C9-esque birth of terminology was because it wasn't needed. The term own goal already says it all. You scored on yourself, dummy. You don't even need an opposing team. You're your own biggest enemy and goddamn are you bad at defending against yourself. But on the flip side, own goal is extremely literal. You scored on your own goal. It was a goal, but an own goal. The poison for Kuzco. Kuzco's poison. The term has definitely taken on wider metaphorical meaning, referring to any scenario where you somehow manage to self-inflict a wound without needing any outside help, but it's harder for it to lose its core meaning. C9, by contrast, isn't literal at all. Nothing about the term C9 says anything about the actual conditions that need to be met. It's pure vibes and association. It's the poutine of gaming terminology, a term that only describes a concept without locking it to any literal meaning, and thus it's ripe for warping. For every time the term C9 is used correctly, there are a dozen instances of it being used wrong. People will use it to describe any scenario where the enemy team was not fully wiped at the end of the match, or where they got pulled off the point by an ult, or any number of other scenarios where it just doesn't apply. But why? Well, because that's also part of how language is constructed. Outside of languages like French, which are much more prescriptive and rigid, especially in Quebec with the Office Québécois de la langue française strictly regulating what words can and can't be used, i.e. chien chaud for hot dog instead of just using hot dog like in France, language bends and warps based on vibes and usage. Frindle didn't mean anything, but because it was used to mean pen, it became a synonym for pen in that story. C9 didn't mean anything in this context until a random Overwatch match in 2017 that almost nobody who uses the term actually watched, but because it became associated with a specific situation, it also became associated with the vibes and emotions that are part of the situation. C9 warped because people took different meanings from it. For some, it described the conditions that brought about those feelings, and for others, it described the feelings that were brought about by those conditions. In theory, this feels like a chicken and the egg situation. Did we develop the term because we needed to explain the mechanics of the fuck up or the feelings of the fuck up? Obviously there's a little of both regardless, but what's the priority? Are those feelings intrinsically and exclusively linked to the mechanics, or is it possible for the mechanics and feelings to happen independently of each other? Does it matter that it'll change depending on the context it's used in? For example, if someone asks, "You sound annoyed, what's up?" and I say, "My teammate's C9'd," am I trying to communicate the specific way in which we lost? Or am I trying to communicate the specific emotional impact that losing like that had on me? Even if I'm not describing a textbook C9, if I feel like I got C9'd and that's why I'm annoyed, am I still using the word right? After all, I'm communicating how I'm feeling to my friend, which is what they wanted to know. But how much does that matter? Eventually, you start having the same kinds of debates that you'd have about Poutine. What is actually essential for a C9? We know the ingredients, but which ones are essential, and what specifically about them is essential? Does it have to be cheese curds, or can it just be cheese? Does your team have to have actually been on the point and walked off, or is it enough to just have theoretically been able to be on the point and just inexplicably not going for it? And look, part of this is that language is inherently imperfect. All language, not just C9 or Poutine or Frindle, is vulnerable to this kind of warping. I can tell you I'm sitting on a chair, and even though we both know what a chair is, you actually really have no idea what I'm sitting on. Is it a stool? Is it a rocking chair? Is it a lazy boy? Is it a wooden dining table chair? Is it a beanbag chair? Is it an office chair? Is it the KDA Secret Lab gamer chair that I bought because I was really into KDA and wanted to treat myself a few years back? Who's to say? You don't know. But you do know that I'm sitting on a chair, and your mind will fill in the gaps. If I say I'm eating poutine, you probably know what it is. And if not, you should go try it, it's delicious. But what exactly am I saying? Is it authentic poutine? Did I make it myself? Did I get it from McDonald's? Did I use real cheese curds? Did I say poutine or poutine like a filthy Anglo? Did I add in some mix-ins? Even if we share the word, it is inherently an oversimplification. Even in situations where it's hyper-literal, like with own goal, there's still a lot of blanks being left in that. Did Steve Smith deliberately shoot the puck at his own net? Did it bounce off his skate? Did he try to pass it back to his defenseman after pulling the goalie, miss the pass, and accidentally score on an open net? No, he accidentally bounced it off the back of the goalie's leg. But all of those scenarios are own goals despite being extremely different. C9's kind of the reverse of this, because it refers to a specific scenario, but it's also used to describe so many other scenarios. And even if you and I agree that someone's using it in a way that objectively doesn't meet the criteria for a C9 as it was originally coined, it doesn't stop people from using it that way. Frindle is a word that means nothing, but if everyone uses Frindle instead of pen, at some point the word does mean pen. If people are using C9 to refer to these general feelings of, we won the fight but forgot to claim the prize, or you're good at the game but better at being a fucking idiot, then at what point are those the meanings of the word? Is the original specific meaning of C9 something that is important enough to preserve? Should we try to find more accurate terminology for that broader feeling, similar to how quill and pen could once be treated as synonymous but eventually needed to be more clearly defined and split in colloquial usage? To be clear, I am on the side of trying to maintain C9's specific meaning, not acquiescing to this vibes-based, anytime I want to talk trash, I'll call it a C9 approach. This word does have a meaning, and it's a meaning that's more valuable to preserve than it is to abandon. However, that doesn't mean that'll win. A term like gaslighting was unambiguously an extremely useful term to have developed to describe a very specific phenomenon. But it's also a term that's extended beyond that initial specific meaning in a way that's diluted some of what made it work in the past. And at this point, its meaning has now clearly changed in colloquial usage. Would it have been better for it to remain specific? Almost certainly yes. But that's not what happened. And while we can lament the way that language has constructed its way out of its original utility, it doesn't change that the word has a broader meaning now. When I'm talking about how gamers construct language, I'm talking about both sides of this. How a term comes into existence as well as how the term evolves. Evolution is not some uniform universal march in the right direction. It's random mutations that might be good or bad depending on context and circumstances that affect the survival of the evolved thing. A word's usage might evolve to become more useful, or it might evolve to become less useful. But neither of those things happens without human beings constructing the language. We're building without blueprints, trying to find ways to communicate complex thoughts and feelings and concepts and principles with strange noises and chicken scratch nonsense written with frindles dipped in squid ink gravy that may or may not be a valid poutine ingredient. We are in a world where people are writing English PhD dissertations on the politics and ethics of smell in literature because the language we use to describe smell and its relation to people, places, and things is so complex that it can be studied in depth like that. Language is constructed by imperfect people, interpreted by imperfect people, and used by 19-year-old gold Genjis with brain damage and Adderall addictions to try and make you feel bad about losing a game to them. In a way, it's kind of cool to think about if you can forget about how goddamn frustrating it all can be. And that's where we're going to end this one. Thank you for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, consider liking, leaving a comment, and subscribing. You might also want to consider becoming a channel member, since my channel members on YouTube and Patreon get to pick one video per month for me to make, including the one you just watched. Memberships cost $5 a month and can be purchased at the links in the description, and if you join right now, you'll get to vote in the December Members' Choice poll between these 4 topics. First, Drag Race and the Death of Competition. A returning topic from the October bonus poll, this video would be about how competitions die competitive deaths, using RuPaul's Drag Race as the case study into how strong competitive formats can be weakened over time. Second, why everyone agrees that sound's important. A returning topic from the July, September, and November polls, this video would explore not only why sound design and music are so important in gaming, but why it seems like nearly everyone agrees on that. Third, mythical Pokemon were a bad idea that's only become worse with time. The first new topic for December, this video would be about a long-standing beef I have with Game Freak for creating a category of Pokemon that I, someone who grew up in rural Alberta, would literally never get to access legitimately, and why I think mythical Pokemon somehow managed to suck even more as a concept over time. Finally, stop changing the game for the sake of changing it. The second new topic for December, this video would make the argument for an end to balance changes, or at least a significant curtailing of them as a way to actually improve competitive games. There have been a few changes to the Members' Choice polls for December as well. We're moving from 5 topics to 4 topics, we're doing ranked choice voting, and a few other things that you can learn more about in the Members' Choice voting explainer video that I'll link in the description if you're curious. Members can find the link to the Google form on the platform where they became a member. Links to those posts are also in the description, or in the Discord server, and voting will be open until midnight on December 10th. The winning topic should come out at the end of December, but it'll honestly really depend on how much energy I have left after getting the V3 video done. That shit has become a behemoth of a video, and I can't wait for you guys to see it, but it's definitely taking a lot more work than I maybe initially budgeted for. Anyways, before I ramble too long here, let me just quickly thank the channel members. At the $25 Elite membership tier, thank you Jules Coolness. At the $10 Premium membership tier, thank you to Tortoise, Anjatenar, and a Ghost Bat. At the $5 channel membership tier, thank you to Mini Q, Cage the Orc, Fish Toast, Alex Stone, Nemo the Survivor, Destiny, Yoshi of the Wire, CatLover192, Cadence, Windex the Great, V, Deleathers, Gavos, Marsh Alice, Crimson Cyclo, Good Guy Luis, Corey, Hallucigeno, MV, The Only Enigma, Hazmat, Attic Games, Mariah, Amon Dadley, Meep Cube, Noisy Pitta, Michaela Ketcheraside, Strogman, Harv, Marcy Gaskill, Junkie McRat, and Deku. Whether you're a channel member, a subscriber, or just clicked on this video out of curiosity, thank you very much for watching, and I hope I'll see you around again soon.